Welcome back to Little Wars TV. I'm Greg, and this week we'll be visiting one of the most important battlefields in the United States that you've probably never heard of, Princeton. The Battle of Princeton was the climax of George Washington's daring 10-day winter campaign in New Jersey. Keith and I will walk the battlefield together and have a lively discussion debating whether this small engagement might have been the most significant victory in the entire American War of Independence. Then I'll referee a 28mm war game where 3 players from our club refight the Battle of Princeton using fog of war and written communication to simulate some of the confusion the historical commanders faced in January 1777. It's going to be a fun battlefield tour and a hard-fought war game. So let's go rewrite history.
All right, now before Greg and I debate the significance of the battle and the overall outcome of the war, how this battle applies to that, we should probably talk about how the armies bumped into each other and how this battle essentially happened by accident.
Yeah, but before we even get to that, I think we have to understand the context of the winter 1776-77.
Right.
And how would you explain the mood in the American army at that time?
The mood was
Yeah, that about sums it up. It had been almost a year and a half since the first shots of the war were fired at Lexington and Concord, and during that time the British seemed well on their way to snuffing out the American cause.
After withdrawing from Boston, General Howe re-landed at New York, capturing the city and easily outfoxing Washington. The entire campaign was an American disaster, with Washington running for his life.
George Washington ended the year 1776 retreating across the Delaware to put a barrier between himself and the British. Rumors swirled that his job as commander-in-chief might be in jeopardy.
Howe ended the year 1776 as the toast of London, fanning speculation the entire rebellion might be stamped out the following season. He wintered his forces spread across the state of New Jersey in 17 cantonments. In hindsight, that would prove a critical blunder.
Now, in fairness, Howe viewed his winter deployment as a very sensible logistical decision because armies in this period of history rarely engaged in ungentlemanly winter activity. Unsporting winter activity.
See, but Washington was desperate. He saw the tactical deployment of Howe as an opportunity to attack and pick off an isolated garrison. On Christmas Eve, 1776, Washington and his army crossed the frozen Delaware River in an operation flirting somewhere between bold genius and suicidal madness.
The American plan was complex, aiming to surprise 2 garrisons at once. Predictably, that plan fell apart, but Washington did manage to achieve a stunning victory at Trenton, bagging most of the Hessian garrison on Christmas morning.
Washington retreated back across the Delaware River, and when he noticed that the British weren't really pursuing him, he decided to gamble on crossing back over the river again.
Double or nothing.
Double or nothing.
Well, that's true, and I think Washington was feeling emboldened by the success that he had just had at Trenton. But what he didn't realize is that the British were not sitting idly by, because Howe had just ordered General Cornwallis to take 9,000 men from New York City and march down to New Jersey to deal with the Americans. Cornwallis marched to a British supply base at Princeton and must have been pleased to hear that Washington was still on the western side of the Delaware. The British immediately moved to attack, delighted to find the Americans with their backs to an impassable river.
Now, Cornwallis arrived too late in the day on January 2nd to really engage in a full assault, but he was gearing up to make the killing blow the next day.
Except that Washington wasn't going to wait around for that killing blow to ever land. He left a token force to keep the fires burning along the Assunpink Creek while secretly marching his 6,000 men around the British left to strike at their supply base at Princeton.
Cornwallis had left about 1,200 men to garrison Princeton, and Washington must have been dreaming about bagging this prize, just like he did at Trenton.
And that brings us to this place, the accidental battlefield just outside of Princeton. While Washington was marching his army north in the dead of night, he had no idea that the British garrison at Princeton was actually under orders to march south at dawn the next morning to join the main assault along the Assunpink Creek.
Oops. On the morning of January 3rd, Colonel Maude's 4th Brigade is marching down the road to join Cornwallis, while Washington's army is taking a rugged back road the other direction. The two forces are on the verge of missing each other entirely, except Washington orders a few hundred men to break off and destroy a bridge over the Stony Brook Creek.
Maude, who was on the hill behind us, ordered his men to deploy for action, and he runs into the tail end of the American column, which had been marching the other way.
And it was a close-run thing, too. This in battle includes a ferocious bayonet charge by the British regulars right across this field here.
An American general, Hugh Mercer, was bayoneted to death near this very oak tree when he refused to surrender to the British and drew his sword instead.
And most famously, Washington himself rides between the lines right in this field here, rallies his militia, and saves the day.
Yeah, and the British thought that they killed Washington here. A near miss.
Near miss.
So many cool individual stories like that from this battlefield. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover all of those in this video. That's not what we're doing here, but if you want to learn more about the Battle of Princeton, you should check back next week for our battlefield walk. Keith and I are going to do a full tour, just like we did at Antietam a couple of months ago.
Princeton was a clear American victory. What's not really clear is the significance of that to the wider war.
Well, I think that if you asked Americans at the time in 1777, they would have told you it was very important. Support for Washington soared after newspaper reports of this battle came out as a major American accomplishment.
Was it that, or was it that 4,000 Americans defeated 1,000 British, and really the British retreated in good order, and that's it?
All right, tactically, I agree, this was far from a masterpiece, but strategically, you have to admit that this changed everything. Washington's 10-day campaign across the Delaware forced Howe to abandon southern New Jersey, and that perception of British retreat and potential defeat just sparked American enthusiasm for the war effort.
See, but that's my point. It was just perception. This whole New Jersey affair back in London was not considered to be anything more than a minor tactical setback. It didn't matter to the wider war, and the British had no intention of quitting.
We needed these victories desperately to make it another year in this war. American morale was on the verge of total collapse before Washington crossed the Delaware.
Well, let's just say this. From the American perspective, this was decisive. From the British perspective, not so much. Remember to join us next week for a battlefield tour of Princeton. For now, let's get back to the club and set up our table and get the game ready and see if I can bloody Washington's nose playing as Colonel Mawhood.
This 6-foot by 8-foot tabletop represents the fiercest part of the engagement at the battle. This is the area between the William and Thomas Clark farms. And because it's a surprise meeting engagement, none of the miniatures are starting on the table. Everything will begin off table, and our initial movements will all be hidden.
I'll be Colonel Mawhood of the British 4th Brigade.
I'll be playing General Hugh Mercer, the ranking American officer on the field at the start of the day.
And where is General Washington?
That is an excellent question. The two of you are actually going to be the only two players that are at the table to start. General Washington is not here, and Brian, he's going to be relying on you in the beginning part of this battle to be sending him written notes and communication about what is happening here.
Okay.
I love games with that kind of fog of war mechanics. So what are our objectives?
Well, because you are the British player and the only British player, I can brief you directly on your objectives. But Brian, unfortunately for you, the American objectives at this battle are a need-to-know information, and right now, you don't need to know.
I am Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood, and I'm supposed to link up with Cornwallis at Maidenhead, and I don't think that's going to happen. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to turn my line and move down onto the farm and try to push the Americans back, because looking at the table, that at least seems like the best place to be. Until I find out what this force I'm facing is, I'm going to maneuver onto the table and capture some ground to cover myself and make sure that I can possibly buy Cornwallis time to get here, and really kind of find out what the situation is.
Historically, I'm going to be surprised when I meet some difficulty. So I have a objective to cross the board, get to a corner that would be where the Mercer traditionally would have gone and destroyed a bridge, and then cross the table the other way. So I expect the plan to go south almost immediately. I think movement is going to be important today. I have a lot of ground to cover, and I imagine not the greatest amount of time. And also, I hope to be able to report as much detail as possible to my higher command so they can help me.
All right, gentlemen, it is 8 o'clock on the morning of January 3rd, 1777, and we are ready to get this battle going. To play today's battle, we're going to be using Black Powder by Warlord Games. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about Black Powder, you should check back next week for our rule review video.
I'm afraid to ask, but what's the punishment for losing this battle today?
The loser of today's battle will be tarred and feathered. Our game opens with an empty battlefield. Both armies begin off-table, and we're using 28mm figures where a formation of 8 to 16 models represents a regiment. Keith's British Dragoons are the first to arrive on the field, where they spot Mercer's leading colonial regiments pushing through the Thomas Clark farm.
That's a 5.
A 5, so your command value is an 8, and you've gotten a 5, which means you've beaten it by 3, so you have 3 moves.
Outstanding. Nice unit. Pennsylvania rifles.
Okay. So you need an 8 or less.
Got 8.
A sharp firefight drives back the Dragoons, but does slow down Brian's advance. At the end of our first turn, Brian dashes off a message to Washington, noting the location of the British and asking for more troops to outflank the Redcoats. But where is the Commander-in-Chief? And which one of our club members is playing him?
So, General Washington here. I have set forces in motion based on intelligence that we've gathered from the good citizens of the Jerseys to attempt to cut off the British positions at Princeton. At this point, I am moving up the Sawmill Road. Meanwhile, I have directed General Mercer to move up and cut the bridge to prevent any reinforcements from the Trenton area.
Tom's plan to surround the British looks great on paper, but Tom's not at the tabletop to see just how many British formations are arriving to pressure Brian. Mercer is outmanned and giving ground.
All right, a little bit later in the morning, I've had a few messages from General Mercer, who has engaged some cavalry near the bridge, not exactly certain where, and is also now facing 3 regular British regiments who must have come down the road from Princeton. Based on Mercer's pleas, I have sent Cadwallader, Hitchcock to the field, so I am going to head to the field myself, as it sounds like a bit of noise coming from that direction.
Our George Washington arrives on the field, and he does not like what he sees. The British are enveloping Mercer's brigade and taking the fight to the colonials. Tom brings up a large brigade of militia to threaten the British flank. But like any true British general, Keith promptly ignores the militia to focus on Mercer instead.
Yes, yeah. No, actually, I shoot the Pennsylvanians. 2 hits.
It looks like Keith's persistence is paying dividends, with superior British firepower battering Mercer's small brigade. What will the colonial commanders do to flip the script?
All right, well, it's the start of turn 8. Cadwallader's brigade has moved onto the table, slowly, but moving forward.
Yeah, Mercer's brigade is being historically stubborn, not by my particular choice. By the dice have been not letting me move out of my position, which isn't very good right now. So hopefully we can get ourselves a little space. We're about to find out.
I'm facing off against Mercer's brigade. I feel pretty good about it. I'm in a good position to really shoot him up. So I feel good about that. But there is a lot of rebels, scum, coming over the hill. And so I really need to push Mercer's brigade away. And if I don't, I might be screwed. So we'll see what happens.
With Tom's militia on the horizon, Keith finally commits one of his regiments to swing toward them. But he's largely doubling down on his plan to focus the rest of Maud's troops on cracking Mercer before Washington can intervene.
I'll do the Grenadiers first. I got 7.
Okay, so Keith is getting 7 dice. How many dice are you getting on that, Brian?
4.
You are getting 4 dice. Let's look and see if there are any modifiers. +1 for charging to hit.
Okay.
So now you will hit on 3s.
Okay.
So that is it, and you're both looking for 4s or better.
Ooh, 3 hits.
No hits.
Excellent.
The British fix bayonets and drive home a furious charge. Not only do they rout 2 colonial regiments, they also manage to wound Hugh Mercer. Poor guy just can't catch a break in real life or in our game. It's been slow going for Tom's troops with poor command rolls, but after watching Mercer go down, the militia somehow kick into gear at the double quick. Is it too late? Keith is now able to turn to face them with his full force. But at this critical moment in the battle, Keith receives some urgent news from yours truly. So it's at this point that some troops that you had historically left behind in the town of Princeton have been able to get a courier out to you to let you know that they are actually under attack as well. It appears as if leading elements of the rebel army have already made it all the way to Princeton.
Okay.
So now it is decision time for you.
Yeah. I've got to decide whether I'm going to go back to Princeton and help there or continue on to Cornwallis. I feel that I should probably just let Cornwallis fend for himself. He's got a fairly large force. And I think going back to Princeton and defending Brunswick is more important at this point. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to pull back.
Despite his talk of pulling back, Keith smells blood when Tom's militia close ranks. The British instead advance deeper into the Clark Farm fields to engage the rebels. The militia waver, and a Delaware regiment begins to fall back. But in the center of Tom's line, a tiny formation of Marines face an important rally test.
And the Marines, do not embarrass us.
You're in the middle.
Oh,
yeah, they're like,
what? They laugh at all.
Rock steady. Yeah, they're not going anywhere.
Too many of them.
Okay.
Too dumb to know they got shot.
Right.
With Tom's Marines holding the center, Bryan brings up Fermoy's brigade at the Thomas Clark Farm. Their largest formation is actually a regiment of untested colonial Germans. The British position suddenly looks precarious. With Keith tied down against Washington in the center, Fermoy's fresh troops envelop the British right, which is anchored by Maud's best unit, his grenadiers. But even the British grenadiers cannot hold when they're hit on three sides. The flank collapses in a flash, and with the British on the ropes, Washington urges his militia to press the enemy even more closely. Now under irresistible pressure, Keith begins consolidating the remains of his army around the William Clark Farm. He brings up his final reserve, a cobbled-together formation of convalescents and walking wounded, to cover his flank in a desperate attempt to make a fighting withdrawal back to Princeton. These last British reserves drive off a regiment of Tom's Pennsylvania militia and buy Keith just enough breathing room to disengage the surviving half of his brigade. He's relieved to have escaped the tabletop. All right, we have made it to turn 14 at our Battle of Princeton, and I think we can all agree that we are calling it here.
Yes.
Part of the British formation is escaping off of the table, but two British regiments are completely encircled between the two Clark farms, and it's clear that they're both going to be annihilated or captured.
Well, the Grenadiers were actually destroyed.
They were completely destroyed.
Captured, destroyed.
Yes. So, if you remember, in the middle of the game, Keith had to make a decision about what he was going to do, whether he was going to continue on toward Cornwallis or whether he would head back to Princeton. And what had you decided?
I decided to go back to Princeton.
So he decided to go back to Princeton. Unfortunately, based on some decisions that Tom made in the pre-battle for committing his brigades, going back to Princeton is wading into the arms of an American trap. Sullivan's division has completely encircled the road network around Princeton.
That was in another movie.
Yes. And as an admiral once said, it's a trap!
Admiral Snack Bar.
Yes. So I think that we can definitely call this a decisive victory for Washington and for the Americans.
Well, even more than historically then.
Yes, historically, most of the British force actually broke out toward the south. They were breaking out really in all directions, but many of them filtered south toward Cornwallis and toward Maidenhead. Oh. You did get off in good order with half of your army, but you got off in good order
to get to a place where
Tom was waiting for you.
Well, good on you.
Yeah.
Well, General Mercer, or now General Fermoy, as you were at the end, well done. I think the flank over there, you set the stage early to pull the British a bit out of position, and then successfully brought some not that great troops, but large numbers, put them in the right position.
It was an entertaining end of the game. The Germans provided entertainment. I think I said at the beginning of the game, maneuver was going to be important. Mercer not being able to maneuver, I thought for a while was not a good thing. It ended up being overwhelmingly decisive victory for the Americans. So, America.
So that didn't work at all. I got completely surrounded on my right flank, and lost 2 whole regiments, but I was able to extricate the rest of them. Unbeknownst to me, the Americans were maneuvering off table into a position to put themselves between me and Princeton. Table looked great, miniatures looked awesome, had a good time, and lost. It doesn't fit very well. It's not flattering to my fingers. Should have brought baby wipes. Oh.
You're not so big now, are you?
That would suck getting tarred and feathered.
Yeah, it is not joking.
I believe I need my powdered wig.
Well, this is what we do have.
Well, we don't want you to die. Slow down, man. This is a good fellas. This is.
You're not going to cut a finger on? No. Okay.
Since you've been caught in these domains in the servant of a tyrant, we will send a message to all British grenadiers who we so catch that they will not escape the rest of their lives, but with shame.
God save the king.
Don't get the tar on me! There we go.
Oh, it's going down my arm.
We'll soak it up.
Here.
Oh, yeah, we go.
Oh, there we go.
Should have done that ahead of time.
See you next week on Little Wars TV. Yeah, there are worse things than being tarred and feathered.
It's true.
Oh, man.